And the songs and music moves me. But just hearing the language, it's almost like this every time I sit there. And so I've noticed, and I struggle sometimes with saying some of the prayers, because if I shift them into gender-neutral language, then I'm separating from myself from the community, and the communal experience. And so I struggle with that. There's an interior struggle with that. And I want to say it's resolved. I want to say I've arrived, and I want to say that it's resolved. And what I'm recognizing is that the struggle itself is the path, and it seems to be the one that I'm on. And how can I hold a space for the men and women who come through the groups if I don't hold a space for my own unknowing of what this is going to turn out like? Because I just would like to fast forward to non-duality, to unity with God right now, check that off the list, so that I don't have this anymore. So that I don't sit at Mass and listen to the language and just feel so like our voices aren't heard, and that the tradition forgets our voices. But love doesn't have a gender, and if I can remember that and have that container, that's really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
I suppose it's up to me.
It's all resting on you now.
I've been piecing together different perspectives you have of your life as you move through it. There's only very recently, it's a question I've always had, like while you were saying, well, why did I not sort of do my leaving bit, get out of the tradition? And I grew up an Irish Catholic in a very enlightened family. I would add, that was a great benefit to me. So that they weren't your typical, rather big into ideas and sense of culture and all that. But I think one of the most important figures, it's only recently I've begun to understand. I had an uncle who died at the age of 11, my mother's brother, and obviously left a big scar in her life, dying at that age. And when I was 12, I was in school. And the headmaster, the president of the school, he was beyond approach, he wasn't a figure that boys came near very much, was the man who did the funeral for my nephew. And I one day got into my head, rightly, that I was treated unfairly. And I went up to this man's office in a part of the school that boys didn't normally go into, knocked on his door, and insisted on hearing. And it's only recently I began to realise the impact it must have had on that man. Because he buried my mother's brother. He buried him and we weren't. I have a photograph of him. We look quite alike. And anyway, he took me in, sat me down, heard my story, and said, "Yes, you've got a case." And I'd been given 3 biffs or slugs of leather. This is in Ireland in the 1960s. And he said, "We'll give you credit." Which is great. But a few years later, I had a similar episode with another priest, who again I got. This wasn't to do with corporal punishment actually then, but I mean that was part of the deal. That was in Ireland and Britain, very much so. But I realised I got an unusual experience growing up. And therefore moving, and I had it then at a huge moment in my life where I knew I was called to the priesthood. I felt God naming me. I can tell you the place, what I was doing. It was Easter Sunday actually. And I decided I was going to find out where the Jesuits were in Dublin. I knew of Gardiner Street. I knew no Jesuits. I knew about their history, and I was intrigued something about their history because I had studied it in school. I studied the suppression of the Jesuits. I knew they had died and come back from the dead, and that appealed to me. I also knew that they were kind of experimenters, and my brother, a year or two later, introduced me to Tailleur de Chardin. And I remember the first time I read them, I had to stand up and walk around the place as I was reading, but I found it so exciting. But over those years, I've been part of the institution, and I've been living my life within the structures. And seeing the pain of an awful lot of people, including my own family, and the distancing and the alienation and the frustration, and knowing I could not leave this, and wondering, was there something wrong with me? Was I repressed? Was I, all the sort of, was I, guilt-ridden? And the answer was yes, but, this was still my path. My brother, who introduced me to Thai, also introduced me to yoga, which was also, I used to use yoga as my form of prayer, the yoga exercises, along with the Ignatian exercises, because part of Ignatius is that you position your body as you find helpful. So I said, well, that's okay, that fits here. And also I was aware too of, particularly over here in the States, there was a huge influence, particularly among Irish Jesuits and elements in the Irish Church from the States of things that were happening. And all ideas, people going over to study and all that sort of stuff. So it's always been a big sort of waves of influence, including the whole exploration of Eastern mysticism and experience and all that. And 5 years ago I found myself going to this Benedictine monastery down in New Mexico, and at the same time as Pam, and I met this character who I thought was a bit weird. And I thought she was a big new agey freaky sort of guy, and then she was telling me what she actually did. No. Then she said she was telling me what she actually did with her life. And what she did with people broken, hurt, really rolling up her sleeves, and I realised, no, this is not what I imagined. And I suppose then she invited me over here to Deesdale, and I've been still trying to get rid of me 5 years later. But I found today, actually, as I was celebrating the Mass, I felt very, at the start, the whole weight of, you're talking about the tradition, it is, there's a burden of sin that accumulates. And I've come to understand it around the Gospels. All four of the Gospels turn around a point, and it's the point when Peter recognises Jesus as the Christ or as the Holy One. And up to then it's sort of Jesus is out healing, the crowds are gathering, he's gathering his disciples, he's got the 12, and he sends them out, and they come back, and it's getting better and better and better, and Peter says, you're the Christ. And they all realise, this is the Christ. God, that's fantastic. And then he brings them apart, and the things go downhill, because their gap in their understanding. He starts saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, I'm going to be given over to death. And they're saying, no way. And then also he has the moment where they're in the road saying, who's the greatest? They're having their arguments. They have another moment where they tell the children, no, keep away. And that's very near the edge. And then there's the moment when the moment of the rich young man, where they say, well, how the hell, if you're, if the rich can't get into heaven, who can? And then there's the moment where actually he gives his teaching on divorce, which is actually where their relationship is about to fracture apart. And then they go to Jerusalem, and it does. And then things come back together again. They reassemble through the resurrection, really. And I think that's the story that happens with the whole institution and culture of Catholicism again and again. And I think we're living through that now. And I suppose I feel that and it's all around at the moment. It's all to do with within Catholicism around one way or another. The hurting points are around sexuality. I mean, there's a whole growth of awareness of justice and all that, but people are happy enough with that. But it's all around that whole area, gender, sexuality, that really the pain is and the dying is. And I believe the resurrection is too. I believe, just the image of the crucifix is a significant one for me, because that took 1,000 years. What we call the traditional crucifix took 1,000 years before they had that dead man on the cross with the wound, which is the sign that he was dead, because they had to see that he was dead. But he's hung there for 1,000 years with that nice, polite little loincloth. And we can imagine the nice Roman soldiers say, where's the loincloth, lads? You've got to put the loincloth around them, But I think, now we have to take away that loincloth and reflect on, who he was. And just as when that first crucifix was put in place, people realised he actually suffered, his flesh was torn. It took 1,000 years for them to admit that. In the catacombs, there are no images of the cross. It was too shocking. It was like putting a hangman loose up. And now I think we're at this point where we're going to have to take away that loincloth and understand him as a sexual, and understand the theological implications of that, because it has to be,
Yes.
male and female. And I think that's where we'll find our healing, you know, around that.
Yeah, there's these different points of healing. I mean, obviously, what Father Thomas said at the Integral Contemplative Christianity, which blew me away, is if you don't want to be God, you've missed the point. And that was one of those things. I said, excuse me, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I have to go meditate on that for a while. That was really, really helpful, that piece. And then the other piece was this recognition that those 4 synoptic gospels were only 4 synoptic gospels. There were all of these other missing gospels that weren't used, and why were they chosen, and the political implications of why those 4 were chosen was really helpful to me and very healing to me. To read the Gospel of Thomas, which Elaine Pagels just poured through and translated, learned Aramaic, translated it from Aramaic. And she's talking to a friend of hers who read the Gospel of Thomas, who said, you know, if I'd have read these, I wouldn't have had to become a Buddhist. You know, so to look at the non-dual Jesus and just do it, see the work that Cynthia Bourgeois was bringing us on the non-dual Jesus, and to really deconstruct. I know for the contemplatives the notion of deconstruction. So we're missing the point because that's exterior, but the deconstruction, that movement through rational, feels important. Because whether you're reading Marcus Borg here, or any of the Jesus Seminar, or the feminist theologians, your recognition that this isn't, okay, these 4 were here, that's it, the story, but you're starting to recognize that these were people's experience of the Christ. This is an interior experience. It's a movement inside.